I'm Michelle Garred, and I want to be the first to welcome you to today's session on exploring attitude change in outcome harvesting. Outcome harvesting plus attitude change, or as we often call it, OH plus AC, is a way to add attitude change into your outcome harvesting practice without compromising the behavior focused rigor of the approach. This is going to be a very quick intro today, designed for evaluators who are already familiar with outcome harvesting or its sister approach, outcome mapping. Um, Want to make sure that you all have a copy of the guide available. If you don't yet have one, there will soon be a link to download it posted in the chat window. We want to start getting to know you. So I want to invite you to please say hello in the chat window. Some of you have already started doing that, which is fabulous. Great modeling, Senya, Fiona. We'd love to hear your name, your organization, your location, and a bit more specific to today's session, we'd love to hear in which thematic sectors or for what evaluative purposes you might be thinking about using OH plus AC. That will fuel the conversation as we go along. While you're doing that, I want to invite the facilitation team to unmute and introduce themselves as well. Let's start with Min.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you. My name is Min Ma. I'm the founder and principal of Data Plus Soul Research. I'm based in the United States in Boston, Massachusetts. Just a few things. I've been practicing OH and OH plus AC for many years, mainly for evaluation of programs and initiatives here in the United States. I'm a member of the OH plus AC advisory team, and I worked with Michelle on the 2024 version of the OH plus AC guide. It's nice to be here with you all. Malaka?
Thanks, Min. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. My name is Malaka. I'm a peace building and evaluation independent consultant. My working languages are English and Arabic, and I've been lucky enough to cooperate with Michelle on OH plus AC since 2019. I really love the storytelling aspect of it, and I'm also on the advisory committee with Min and Michelle and a few others.
Nick, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Nicole McGiffin. I am a virtual assistant and I work with Michelle at Ripple Peace Research and Consulting. And I'm based in United States and California. And I am a novice to this work, but I get to learn about all of this great work with the OH and AC advisory team.
Thanks so much to all three of you. I'm Michelle Garred, Ripple Peace Research and Consulting, and working on strategy, evaluation, and learning, mostly in the peace and social justice space. I've been working with outcome harvesting for about 8 years, 7 of which I've also been working on the adaptation of inclusion of attitude change. Throughout the process with amazing people like the team that you see before you. So I'm so grateful to Malaka, Min, and Nick for making this all happen. Jumping in a bit further to our agenda, it's a very simple one. We're going to talk a little bit about why we sometimes add attitude change data in outcome harvesting. Then we'll talk about how we do it. And then we're going to open up for discussion of your questions and curiosities. We aim to spend fully half of our time together on those questions and curiosities, which you will drive by posting questions anytime you like in the chat window. And you can also use the thumbs up icon to upvote or indicate a little support for questions that you like and that you especially want to hear emphasized. Feel free to post those anytime as we go along. Next, a little bit of input for you on why we sometimes add attitude change. to outcome harvesting, or OH. Next. Yeah. Quick refresher. We know all of you have familiarity with outcome harvesting and or outcome mapping, but by way of a quick refresher on what OH is, as you know, it's a very utilization focused, mainly qualitative approach used to retrospectively identify, formulate, verify, and then make sense of outcomes in social change programming. Next. I like to say that there are two things that really make OH OH, the uniquenesses of OH. The first is that retrospective logic, the fact that outcome harvesting does not seek to measure a narrow set of predefined indicators, but rather looks at any change that occurs as a result of the program or intervention, which makes it really suitable to unpredictable contexts. The other uniqueness is the definition of an outcome. You know, in my experience, anyway, the definition of outcome is a little bit of a fuzzy conversation, even among evaluators. We all have slightly different ways of describing what an outcome is, and that sometimes leads to confusion. But that confusion does not exist in OH, right? OH has a very clear definition of an outcome as an observable change in behavior by a social actor as a result of the program or intervention. And of course, that behavior can look like many things. It could be an activity, a practice, a relationship, a policy, etc. But that definition is very clear. So, next, the question arises, with that kind of clarity and the value of that clear behavior focused definition of an outcome in increasing rigor, right? Because it's so objectively verifiable. With that kind of strength and power built into OH, because of its behavior change focus, why would we want to add the attitude change data? We'll unpack that briefly in the next few minutes and explain when and why we do it, which of course requires a quick definition of what in the world we mean by attitude change. We define attitude change as a non-observable change, right? Behavior change is the one that's observable. Attitude change is the one that's non-observable. In many different aspects of the interior of a person, opinions, knowledge, assumptions, beliefs, etc. Any internal shift that's not visible inside of the person, we consider an attitude change, which is admittedly a very broad catch-all term, but we're not alone in using it that way. It's actually used that way in social psychology, where it is intended to be an approach to studying the interrelationships between attitudes and behavior, which is very much similar to what we're doing in OH plus AC. Next. Right. We want to give you a few glimpses of why and when attitudes matter in OH. We would say first and foremost that attitudes matter when internal change within a person that's not observable, is essential to the program results. And we often look at that using a systems change perspective, this metaphor of an iceberg as representative of a complex adaptive system, when what we can see above the waterline are events, underlying human behavior patterns, and what we cannot see deep below the surface are the mental models or the attitudes that are driving the behavior. And yet, sometimes those attitudes are the most strategic entry point for changing the system. So, if your program reflects that reality, right? If there is a sense that the attitudes are the key entry point for creating social change, then that is an OH evaluation that should probably include attitude change data. Next. We also would say that attitudes matter in OH when those attitudes are central to the worldview of the program implementers or the social actors. It's really an invitation to recall the principles of multicultural validity, which tell us that alignment with the cultural context is not an optional extra. It's a core criterion for rigor in evaluation. And yet, the exclusive focus of mainstream OH, its exclusive focus on observable behavior change, on what can be seen, actually does not necessarily align with how many of the world's cultures understand and experience life, right? So, including attitude change as a representation of the inner life is one way to broaden our understanding of what makes for valid knowledge when working across national or people groups or professional sectors, I would add as well. Next. We also want to mention that attitudes matter in OH for understanding how social change happens. And this is a very quick look at a rather complex topic. But if you look at this results diagram, most importantly, you will see that at the outcome level, there's an interplay of two realities happening. The behavior changes are present and the attitude changes are present, and they are interacting to catalyze and mutually influence each other, sometimes like a feedback loop or even a spiral. And we see that interaction as very important in the social change process. And yet, the behavior changes are required to achieve impact. You'll see that there is no direct arrow between attitude change and social change, right? Change only happens when it is manifested in behavior, and without the behavior change, there is no impact. There's much more we could unpack here, but we'll save it for later if the Q&A prompts us to. In big picture terms, I imagine you've all probably seen instances in which attitudes mattered in evaluation, possibly in OH evaluation. And a big picture example of that comes from a tier fund peace program several years back in Iraq that produced evidence of a lot of compelling behavior changes in terms of people from different ethno-religious groups that had been in conflict coming together to collaborate in new and unusual ways. So a lot of compelling behavior changes. And yet, when I talked to the participants and the leaders on the ground, what they were talking about most of the time were the attitude changes. And when I talked to one female leader in particular, she said the fact that I was able to bring together 20 women from different faith groups in this context is a miracle, her words, because I had to earn their trust and we had to overcome what she called, the tribal spirit of all the women that wanted to keep themselves separate. So she was clearly pointing to the attitude change as the most important driver in her experience of the change that she was part of. And that's a pretty common yet compelling example. There's a few others that might be a bit less intuitive. One thing we want to point out is that attitude change, just like behavior change, might be unintended. In another tier fund peace program, this one in Egypt, working across interfaith lines. There was one participant who experienced such an unprecedented acceptance and unity and beauty within the project cohort that he was a part of that he began to find it really difficult to return to everyday life, like stressful and depressing when he left the project cohort and returned to everyday life. A clear example of an unintended attitude change. And when the evaluation uncovered that unintended attitude change, or AC, it helped the implementers to consider how, in the next phase of programming, they could add in some elements of re-entry support to assist participants with just that dilemma. Also worth pointing out, Nick, we're going to stay on the same slide for a moment, that assumptions about attitude change are sometimes incorrect. For example, in a US-based program that I recently worked on that was aimed at reducing political polarization, participants did experience, as expected, some attitude changes about their relationships with people of different political positions, different political parties. However, while the program implementers and yes, even the evaluators had assumed that attitude change would be about people developing a more favorable view of the other, right? The other perspective, the other party. That attitude change data showed that what was actually happening more commonly was that the participants were changing their views of themselves. They were actually re-evaluating who they wanted to be in the midst of a conflicted context, and they were reinterpreting themselves as a people with a higher capacity for acceptance and tolerance of those who were different. And then their behaviors began to change. But this really points out the importance of not making assumptions about what kind of attitude changes are taking place in our programs. If the attitude changes matter, then we need to have the data available to reality check what kinds of attitude changes those are so we can factor it into our programming. Next, and last quick example from me is that behavior changes may have unexpected attitudinal drivers that we don't discover unless we investigate the AC data. For example, in a multi-country leadership development program that I recently worked on for religious women in Africa, almost all of the participants did adopt new or different leadership behaviors, as expected. And the data showed that the attitude changes that were most strongly correlated with those behavior changes were two things. One was increase in confidence or courage, which was somewhat foreseeable. And secondly, the experience of receiving spiritual guidance. That one, for some evaluators, might not be expected, right? Most evaluators coming in with a secular lens would not have expected a spiritually oriented attitude change. And the important thing about that is you don't have to have any kind of particular belief about the nature of spiritual guidance in order to see in that data that spiritual experience was a critical part of unlocking change in that program. And once the attitude change data within the OH evaluation uncovered that reality, it allowed for spirituality to be incorporated more explicitly into the theory of change. So that is more than enough for me on why we add OH and what it looks like in real life. And I am happy to hand off to Min to explain how we do it.
Thanks, Michelle. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a very quick run through of how we actually go through the OH process with the addition of attitude change layered in. And my goal is really to walk you through the differences. So before we do that, on the next slide, it's important to note first that we're really aiming to uphold OH principles in several ways. The first is that we retain OH's behavior-centered definition of an outcome. So we call behavior changes the outcomes, and those are abbreviated as BCs throughout this presentation, throughout the guide. And then attitude changes then are not considered outcomes per se, they are additional components within the data set. And so I'll demonstrate how those, how that additional layer of data is analyzed. So that's just to set the ground rules for how we're going to engage in this. On the next slide, you'll see the what I assume is familiar to most of you, the 6 steps of outcome harvesting. So I'll walk through each of these steps and how AC shows up. So first, on the next slide, Michelle already kind of described some of the key considerations as you're designing the outcome harvest. You're working with the primary users to think about, is AC data really needed in this evaluation? And so Michelle mentioned our 2 considerations: are attitudes essential to achieving program results? And are attitudes central to the worldview of the program implementers or social actors? And so really that's to get you thinking about connecting over to the use, right? Will the primary users have the capacity to meaningfully adjust the program based, or the theory of change based on findings? And so that's very much tied to what's in the left column. We've identified a few other enabling conditions, and so you might want to think about first, whether you have the evaluation team capacity to document, refine, and analyze a more complex data set, because you are going to be gathering more data. We find that it is helpful to have prior hands-on experience with mainstream OH before embarking on this. And it's important to recognize that the level of effort needed to gather and analyze the data will increase. And you need a little bit more skill for collecting the data and also analyzing it. And I'll describe that a little bit. You'll also, for the second bullet, you'll also need to be able to communicate directly with some of the actors who were influenced by the program, from whom you would be gathering or substantiating AC data, and that's simply because ACs are not observable and therefore can only be verified by the people who experience them. So you have to think about whether your evaluation team has sufficient access to those people, conversational skills, and language capacity to be able to communicate with those social actors. Okay, thanks, Nick. Next slide. Okay, so as we move into identifying and drafting BC statements, steps 2 and 3, engaging with human sources, you'll see this in this data collection template that we did pull from the guide. You'll see these 3 boxes in blue are what you would recognize from mainstream OH. You are describing the behavior change, describing the contribution of the program, and then you're documenting why that's significant. And so with AC, if you click through, Nick, we're adding a new column that is tied to the BC, the backbone. The BCs remain the backbone of the data set, and what we're adding is an additional column that is for the related attitude change. And so you're collecting who changed their attitude, what changed, and Michelle described what some of these might look like, and when did that occur, approximately when that happened. The last thing I'll note is that you're also going to want to decide how you're going to track attitude changes that come up as you're gathering data that don't seem tied to a behavior change. One suggestion is to have a different tab in your Excel spreadsheet, for example, that just tracks these lone attitude changes, and you're still collecting the same data. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about how you would analyze that. On the next slide, we look at substantiation. And so as a reminder, that's the formal process of confirming that the data you've gathered is true. You might have you might have gone through steps 2 and 3, just looking at secondary sources, and your substantiation phase is about speaking with primary sources, or vice versa. But either way, the substantiation phase is about verifying the accuracy of data and also using those conversations as an opportunity to expand your understanding of change. And so during substantiation, as with mainstream OH, you're deciding what portion of the data set to substantiate and who you're going to ask. And so some considerations for you, since AC data can only be substantiated by the social actors for whom the change happened. We call those self-substantiators. If you can go forward, Nick. Yep. We call those self-substantiators. So they're able to speak to their own attitude changes in detail. If you choose to substantiate with observers, and it's probably ideal that you substantiate with a mix of the two. We offer some options for substantiating with observers. You might, in the first column, you might invite the observer to comment on the attitude change. But you would note that it's not actually substantiated until you've spoken with the individual, or you might omit the attitude change entirely from that part of substantiation. In the guide, you'll see a lot more detail about how to navigate this, but I wanted to pull out some parts of that for you to engage with here. Okay, on the next slide, we look then at how we analyze and interpret the harvested outcomes. And so some of the differences here, you would categorize attitude changes in the same ways you would behavior changes, BCs. And so if you look at the first 3 white rows for attitude change, you can see that we created some categories: experienced an increase in confidence or courage, experienced a change in it's too small for me to read on the screen, in perceptions, experience new spiritual guidance. And so you can see how we've kind of categorized those and then put them in a table against the behavior changes as a cross tabulation to see, well, how frequently did changes in courage or confidence come up in relation to new or changed leadership behavior, developing new partnerships, etc. A table is a way to look at this. On the next slide, we offer another view of it, which is more of a visualization that really helps you see where there are stronger correlations between the ACs and the BCs. So you can imagine having more of an analysis here. You can see that experience increase in confidence and courage is correlated in some way with changed leadership behavior, as is in the third row, experience new spiritual guidance. That in this data set, it is also strongly correlated with changed leadership or behavior, at least in relation to the other ACs and BCs that we collected. Finally, thinking about other ways to analyze and interpret, BC chain diagrams are, you're probably familiar with these from mainstream OH. These are useful here too. And so what we've added here in this example, so this is connecting the BCs, but also adding the ACs in blue. And so you can kind of see how the BCs and ACs have interacted over time within this particular BC chain. And as you can imagine, when it comes back to supporting use of findings, that this could be a tool in helping you and the primary evaluation users in developing or revising theories of change. And with that, I'll turn it over to Malaka, who's going to help us field questions and invite you all to jump in.
Yeah, if we wanted to open it up, this could be questions, it could be a discussion. Even I've noticed that there's a lot of people who have outcome harvesting experience. Maybe there's a little nagging voice that's asking questions about how you're incorporating attitude change into your practice. So it doesn't necessarily have to be specific questions about the presentation. It could be a challenge that you're sort of working through as you think about attitude changes. Feel free to unmute yourself and share. You can also share the question in the comments if you are unable to speak or you don't feel comfortable with that at the time. Any curiosities, potential issues you might think would come up when bringing in attitude changes? So for me, when I first started with this, I did the opposite of what we suggested, where you start with outcome harvesting and then you bring attitude change in. And I did it all at once. And it was very overwhelming. And trying to divide up between the attitude changes and the behavior changes, it took a lot of time. But since I started in Egypt, it really leaned into the storytelling aspect, which was actually a lot of fun, really asking those questions of what changes did you see? And almost feeling like I was a part of the town gossip as they were sharing all the changes that happened. Um, if anybody has been using outcome harvesting, if you want to share your experience with outcome harvesting and maybe those potential pings where you're like, oh, yes, I can incorporate attitudes here, or I've heard attitudes and I wanted to put them into my outcome statement, but I wasn't able to. Even that, just any experience you'd like to bring into the group. Yeah, Katie Houston, please.
Okay. Hi. So I was trying to write this in the chat and I was finding it hard to articulate. I think so where I'm working is on a systems change initiative. I'm not using outcomes harvesting in a very strict way, but we have been quite inspired by a lot of its aspects and how we collect qualitative data. One thing that often comes up is people report that other people's attitudes have changed. And I think what you guys presented was very much more focused on people reporting their own attitudinal change, which is obviously it's very true to them, right? We can count it as valid from the person who's saying it. But I often get people saying, oh, my colleagues in government used to, blame social grants for too much teen pregnancy. But ever since we presented the data, we now see more openness to expanding the social safety net, for example. So yeah, I guess that a lot of the shifts we see that are the early indications of systems change, where the policy hasn't changed yet, but the conversation is changing, involve the attitudes of others shifting in ways that are observable through relationships. So I'm curious if this approach has a way to deal with that with some rigor and structure, because I feel like I don't quite have a rigorous, structured way of doing that right now.
Michelle, would you like to field that question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Katie, what you're working on sounds really fascinating. When it comes to the question of people commenting on other people's attitude changes, we actually do allow for that in OH plus AC. So the initial indication that an attitude change might be happening can come either from the person who experienced it or from someone who's observing. But what we're very careful about is to ensure that we never consider that attitude change as verified until we check with the person who experienced it. Because naturally, it's not observable. The person who's observing is guessing at best. And what we often find is when someone thinks they see an attitude change happening in someone else, they're usually right about the existence of some sort of an attitude change and very often wrong about the nature of what it is. So we make sure that we find a way to verify that attitude change with the person who experienced it. And often, when we're using OH plus AC in its mainly qualitative form, we do that conversationally, either by talking to those participants while refining the outcomes or later on in the substantiation phase. But it would also be possible if you were doing a mixed methods approach and later adding in some quantitative surveying, you could take the attitude change hints and leads from the OH plus AC data and build it in to a survey. Does that help? Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. There was a question that was dropped in the chat for Min. You mentioned thinking about what we do with ACs we identify that aren't connected to BCs in analysis. Would love to spend a few minutes thinking on that together.
Thanks for that question, and thanks for the reminder to go back to those lone ACs. Yeah, I think of those as it's data, right? And so if we're documenting those in a separate list, I think they can do a lot to tell us about how change is unfolding or not. You might look at a bunch of lone ACs and, once you've kind of confirmed that they're not actually connected to any of the BCs you've captured, that may be data in itself. And you might think, well, why hasn't that attitude changed? Which, especially if it's something that you consider to be important for the change you're trying to capture, or that the primary users are interested in, you might think about, well, why, if the attitude change is happening, but the related behavior change isn't happening, why is that? And is there something we need to reconsider for the program itself? And so that could be one way to use those lone ACs. You might find yourself also capturing a little bit more data on those lone ACs, right? More than just what we'd put in the green column, but you might also look at the contribution and significance of those and, track that along the way. So those are some ways we think about working with lone ACs. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth? Is there anything you'd else? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Karen, I see you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just got in a little bit, what Katie said got me thinking a little bit. I mean, in my organization, we use outcome harvesting as an organizational monitoring and evaluation method. So we gather outcomes from all our projects and programs, also as a way to document results. And often I see people who are in the beginning of a project, they enter outcomes that are based on someone saying something in a meeting that indicates that they have changed their attitudes on something we think is important, right? But usually I tell people that that's really great. It's a great output that you had this workshop, you had this conversation. Please register it in your progress reporting. But until we see that organization person doing something as a result of their new attitude, don't register it as an outcome. So it's not that I don't think, I mean, that's the way we handle it, to say that, of course, sometimes attitude change becomes before behavior change, or often it does, if not always. But following the outcome harvesting methodology definitions, I would say that until it's translated into some kind of observable behavior change, we don't register it as outcomes. But of course, it's not that it's not important, and it should, of course, also it can be recorded elsewhere. So that was a comment, and then I have a little bit of a question maybe, and because we also in my organization, people do a lot of training and capacity building, and sometimes there's an interest to register or document or a learning effect. And in that field, it seems it's knowledge, skills, attitudes is a common concepts. And I struggle a little bit on how to integrate it with outcome harvesting, because yes, it's I don't know if you have any experience with that in a assessment of learning effects, that people have changed knowledge, skills, attitudes. usually that, I mean, in line with what I just said, it might result in behavior change in the long run. But yeah, I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
Thank you, Karen. Min or Michelle, would you like to speak to that point that Karen just shared?
I would. There are two parts, so I'm thinking. Karen, I just want to thank you for sharing that experience and affirm that we really agree with you on maintaining the behavior-centered definition of an outcome. Likewise, we are not changing that, just simply adding in the attitude change data as an additional component in the data set. So we're 100% with you on that. And on that question of how to deal with formulations like knowledge, skills, and abilities that often come up in evaluation, for me, that relates a lot to our very broad definition of attitude change, borrowing from social psychology to say that for our purposes in OH plus AC, we're looking at any kind of non-observable internal shift that's happening inside the person as an attitude. So that actually can include things like changes in knowledge, and attitude changes that are related to skills as well. So it's a little tricky. It involves us thinking about things a bit differently, but what we typically encourage people to do is to say, yes, an increase in knowledge, for example, put it at first under the big umbrella of attitude change, right? And if you feel a need to differentiate it from other kinds of attitude change, we advise waiting until the analysis phase. Right. If you try to differentiate between different types of attitude change early on in the process while you're still harvesting and refining outcomes, it can become quite confusing, and it could actually lead you to miss other patterns that are in the data. But if you're willing to just hold it all in one big attitude change bundle until you get to the analysis phase, then you can really parse it out in whatever way that you want to, because you'll be categorizing those attitude changes just in the same way that you would behavior changes. So you could create categories around knowledge, for example, around attitudes related to skills. And that tends to be how we look at it. With that said, I find the skill part especially tricky because I think skill is part attitude and part behavior. So I often think about how to parse it out, like how the person is thinking about that new skill, that is an attitude, but they're actually demonstrating that they can do it is a behavior. As I see it. How does that sound to you?
Well, I mean, a little complicated, so I might need to think a bit more about, I mean, yeah, it's still a little bit like, yeah, there's so many, yeah, the concepts and how you define them, and people do not agree. And that's also actually what I find is the beauty about outcome harvesting, is that the definition is so strict. So, people can disagree on what is an outcome, but, outcome harvesting has a definition that is, well, you can say, okay, this is the definition in outcome harvesting. You can disagree, but this is how we use it here. So, this thing about agreeing on exactly on what different words and concepts mean, I think that's, yeah, it makes sometimes things a bit more complicated.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, please go ahead, Karen. Kimberly, thank you for waiting so patiently.
No problem, thank you. I appreciate the talk, and I can think very quickly about how to apply this in many of the countries where my organization works, particularly our US programming. But what I was really taken with was the description of the enabling conditions. My organization works in some very difficult places. We've been feeling that, you know, we could do a much better job with some of this stuff than the external evaluators that our principal funder is, you know, pushing us to use. But in some of those contexts, when we think about how we would do this internally, we work in a number of countries where the kind of access to stakeholders that you talked about is really problematic. So I'm talking, you know, Somalia, Myanmar today, not Myanmar 5 years ago, North Korea, right? So I want to ask a question of sort of, can you say a little bit more of how you've tackled this problem, right? Is it sort of, well, we don't have the enabling conditions to do it well, so we're not going to do it? Or here are some of the strategies that you've used to sort of build capacity with staff locally to be able to undertake this kind of work rather than just writing it off entirely. So if you could speak a little bit about in very difficult enabling conditions where that direct access to stakeholders really is a problem, what have you done? What would you think about doing? How would you approach that? Sorry, those are some really difficult contexts at the moment.
Thank you, Kimberly. I don't know if Michelle or Min, you want to share anything about difficult circumstances and contexts to
I think
how.
Michelle probably has more to say about this than I do.
Just because it's happened to us on a number of occasions, you know, in many actually of the same contexts that Kimberly mentioned, just the difficulty of being able to communicate directly with program stakeholders and participants, which can involve a number of things, right? It can involve language, it can involve internet access, it can involve their own physical or reputational security. Like there's a lot going on. And I do think, Kimberly, I do think there are ways to get creative with it, and probably not enough experience in the relatively young OH space with that yet. But we've certainly, you know, used mildly creative mechanisms, like if you can't talk to them directly, then can you establish written communication, you know, different forms of communication, um, taking the time to broaden the team to ensure that it includes people with the appropriate language skills. Oh, actually, that's essential from the outset. The language skills have to be there. Um, but I'm really liking your idea as well of developing over time the capacity of the very local teams to have these types of OH plus AC conversations, right? So that they could be the ones engaging with folks and probing and verifying the data. And I do think it would take probably some time and commitment, like probably best done in an organization that's looking at using this type of evaluation mechanism repeatedly so that it's worth the broad and deep capacity building investment. But I could see that working. So I think you're tapping onto a space where we have some experience and not yet enough. And we really invite you to be creative with us, and let's keep in conversation about what we're all learning about how to get creative in making that access work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I hope we can continue that conversation later on. We'll learn a little bit more right before we end about our community of practice. Rita, I see you have your hand raised. If you could unmute and share your question.
Oh, hello everyone. Thank you for this insightful session. My name is Rita, and I'm sorry I missed the beginning point, so maybe the beginning part of the presentation, so maybe you covered it, but I just wanted to find out concerning, I work for an organization where outcome harvesting is not very widely used, but our project has been endeavoring to pick it up and use it more and more. But then we keep getting this, for lack of a better word, backlash that it's not the main method of sort of collecting outcomes, but it's mostly used where there isn't a definite theory of change. So I just wanted to pick your thoughts on, how to enhance its use and whether outcome harvesting is like mainly used as a side, sort of method of collecting outcomes when you've not really defined your theory of change and all that. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Rita.
you.
Michelle or Min, do you want to speak to the usage of outcome harvesting and outcome harvesting plus attitude change and the element of theory or change, no theory of change, when to go about that?
I can offer a few thoughts. I believe that outcome harvesting and OH plus AC are useful even when you don't have a theory of change, because it kind of gives you data from which you can build theory. And so I find it useful for that. The same way I think it's useful for challenging theories of change, right? And so that's one piece. I do think it can be introduced as a secondary component. And if that's what the organization needs to get on board with it, there's a lot you can do to conduct secondary analysis of data. If there's a lot of data, my team has worked with existing data sets where we've kind of looked through reports for OH and AC data and then used the substantiation phase to go in and ask more questions about that and really flesh that out in ways that would be useful. So I could see that as being a way to introduce the practice and think about what it can do for the organization or the program implementers. So those are some quick thoughts. Karen, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to, to compliment a little bit, because as I understood your question, Rita, it was also about whether outcome harvesting is instead of having a theory of change or results framework. And I often hear that, I don't know if that was correctly understood, but I just wanted to say that I often hear that misunderstanding, that this is just something you do if you didn't plan anything yet. And then you can do outcome harvesting and then you pick up whatever you happened. And that's a criticism I often meet. But I don't agree at all. Of course, you need your theory of change, you need your results framework, donors ask for it, you need it for your planning. So that's planning. You have your theory of change, you have your results framework. And then, of course, we all know that social change just doesn't happen like we foresee it in our results framework or theory of change. We all know that they have so many life in the world is so unforeseeable. So that's why outcome harvesting is a good way of also recording and documenting the results that we didn't foresee, which is not in our theory of change, which is not in our results framework. So these two things are not, they are complementary. And of course, you still measure your indicators. And in my opinion, you can even, use outcome harvesting as a way, not directly as indicators, but you can build in as a way of, a way to measure some more qualitative types of changes related to your indicators. There's ways of doing that. So these, I definitely think that having a results framework and a theory of change should be there. And then you can also use outcome harvesting. That's at least how we do it in my organization.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Karen and Rita, for sharing. Hopefully this is just the beginning of the conversation, and we'll give it to Min so we can wrap up.
Great. We'd love to hear your feedback. And so we're going to put a link in the chat with just a quick feedback survey where we'd love to hear what worked for you, what resonated, and hear your input on what else would be supportive of your outcome harvesting plus attitude change practice. I'm going to offer a few other ways to go deeper with us. There's a link on the slide, and we'll put it in the chat for you to download the guide. You could also sign up for a newsletter that offers periodic updates from the OH plus AC community. And so that's the second link here on this slide. We also host regular exchange learnings. And so this is for folks who are actively using OH plus AC. We're happy to have you join these sessions, and you could come to the session with a question, or ready to kind of present how you're using OH plus AC, and to have folks be in dialogue with others who've had experience. And so we really see that as an exchange, kind of an extension of some of the conversation we're starting to have here together. And then also the debate, right? Karen has offered a perspective on ways that OH plus AC ties to theory of change, theory building work, and a number of us, we all bring different experiences of that, and also different situations with funders and communities, and where that work is starting. So that's a good place to plug in if you're interested in having more of these conversations. And then finally, we do have a regular advisory team that meets to plan these sessions and think about how can we support others in working with OH plus AC. And so we invite you to reach out. You can see the list of current members there, and you can reach out to us, the session organizers, for contact information if you would like. After this session, we will send out via email to everyone who registered a recording of this workshop slides in PDF form, so everything that you've seen presented here. And then we're also going to send out written answers to any of the questions that were not answered during the session, which I think we did capture them all, but if there were any that were missed, we will send that out as well. And with that, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to repeat the session for the other half of the globe that really wasn't included in this timing. And so we do plan to have repeats of this particular session, and hope to see you in subsequent exchange learnings or discussions about OH plus AC. Thank you, everyone.